in the realm where wakefulness meets deep sleep, where the memory of the soul unfolds like a buried scroll, I see what this generation is quietly experiencing. A whisper rises in the dim light of the spirit. Do you hear the footsteps of the young who are leaving the sanctuary, though no one understands why? I see them walking softly across the steps, the wooden doors closing behind them, yet not because they have lost their faith, but because faith is calling them somewhere else. This is the moment the narration begins, not to soothe, but to reveal what has long been written in the records of the soul across centuries. As the light of that vision pours down like a thin stream of honey, a question appears so clearly that it trembles through the deepest layer of the soul. Why is the spirituality of an entire community trembling so sharply in the year 2025? Numbers in the material world are merely markers, but in the world of the soul, they are signals. And the signal I see burning through the atmosphere is the silence of the young, silence carrying more meaning than any long sermon spoken from a wooden pulpit. I see in the inner sight a great church, a high dome, the light passing through stained glass, forming pale yellow bands like ash, a generation entering without feeling they belong, and leaving even though their hearts have never touched the true source of life. As I look deeper into that image, a record in the Akashic field flickers as if waiting to be read that a day will come when the young will stop seeking God through empty rituals and they will return to Him through a direct path without intermediaries, without fear, without imposed structures. That record appears in the form of an ancient verse, and I hear within my mind humanity does not live by outward forms, but by the truth breathed into the soul. And it is because they lack that truth that they withdraw. From this vantage point, I see clearly their weariness, not weariness of God, but of burdens created by human hands. There are gatherings where the spirit is stretched thin by promises of prosperity that never come true, where singing is used like a mist to cover the quiet question inside the heart, why the house of the pastor shines with bright lights, while the homes of believers remain in darkness. I do not speak this to condemn, but because within the deep layer of the collective soul, a movement is rising that many pastors cannot recognize. They assume it is the decline of faith. Yet in the vision, I see it as the awakening of faith. As I observe slowly, the statistics appear like glowing symbols, a 20% drop over 2 decades, only 15% of Gen Z entering church regularly. But I do not see these as signs of decay, rather as the storm clouds announcing a new season. These young people are not abandoning God. They simply no longer hear Him through manufactured noise, and their souls are being drawn toward a quiet land where the true voice becomes clear. In that field of vision, I see ancestors standing by an ancient river, their eyes turned toward their descendants, calling through their gaze. Remember the promise we heard through 1,000 dark nights, that one day our children would walk out of the place that suffocates them and rediscover the voice of the Most High without the cages of doctrine built around them. I sense a gentle reminder echoing through the air. This is not escape. This is return, return to the water untouched by power or profit. And the young are following that call, though they cannot yet explain why. In this vision, I see the silhouette of the year 2025 as a pillar of light, marking the moment when the thickest veil is torn apart. In that very year, the heartbeat of the collective soul shifts, becoming quiet but sharp, strong yet solitary, as if they have heard something others have not yet heard. And I am shown that this departure is not rebellion, but a response to an inward summons, a call to rise from the exhaustion caused by a faith that has been commercialized. All of this movement appears like a wind, not loud, not explosive, yet strong enough to topple the decaying walls of organized religion. I simply relay this vision to you because when you understand the reason for the silence, you will understand the awakening that is coming and why this generation is being called to step into what so many before them only hoped for from afar. In the middle of the year 2025, when statistics began to fall like shards of broken glass from an old era, a larger picture emerged behind the dust of time. The rate at which young people left the church was not merely the result of boredom or doubt, but the expression of a deeper current moving within the collective soul. Reports showed a nearly 20% decline over 2 decades and only about 15% of Gen Z attending regularly. Yet these numbers were only the surface of a spiritual earthquake spreading beneath. For when facing truth, the material world sees decline, but the spiritual world sees rising. A generation cannot live on the echoes of the faith of those before them. They demand the true voice from within, and when they no longer hear it in sanctuaries, they quietly turn away. In that movement, there is no hatred, only honesty toward the calling of the soul. Sunday services have grown too heavy with ritual and too light with truth, and the hearts of young people sense that imbalance the way one senses an instrument that has gone out of tune. They see the pastor step onto the platform under bright lights, see the confident smile and the sharp suit, yet they do not feel a stream of inner light flowing from that person and their souls. Know something is not right. They hear promises of financial harvest while watching relatives drown in debt. They hear sermons about hope, yet find no comfort when sorrow comes. They hear adults call the church their home, yet see more judgment than healing. Statistics cannot explain this feeling, but the soul can. This is the rise of intuition, the same intuition their ancestors once lived by, an intuition that knows when a sacred place has been mixed with worldly power. Many young people do not say it aloud, but they feel that the large rooms carry more echoes of human ambition than the presence of God. The numbers show their absence, but the truth is they are present elsewhere in quieter spaces where they begin speaking with themselves and with the one they believe in without anyone standing between. One young person said that when sitting in church, the mind felt trapped in a mold, but at home, with the Bible open, the mind felt wide and free. Another said that when they stopped giving out of habit, a warm peace flowed through their chest like water. These testimonies are not isolated experiences, but links in a chain of transformation, spreading in ways traditional pastors cannot touch. From a spiritual perspective, this departure resembles a field being plowed before planting season. The hard, dry soil is turned over so new roots can reach the soft ground beneath. Young people feel the dryness in the church atmosphere not because the singing is less beautiful or the sermons less passionate, but because the deep well of life has been blocked by human structures. And this generation, unlike the ones before it, carries a sharper intuition because they're not afraid to face truth, even when truth hurts. Numbers record behavior, but the soul records the reason. And the reason is that this departure is not escape, but return. They are leaving a system their ancestors were once forced into, and they are returning to a path of personal dialogue with the Creator where there are no lights, no VIP seats, no offering fees, only the heart and the truth. While researchers call this a crisis of faith in the spiritual vision, it is a season of refinement, a season in which young souls refuse to drink the muddy water poured by human hands and begin seeking the original stream that nourished their ancestors before history tore them from their roots. This departure is therefore not a sign of loss, but the declaration that the soul knows its way home when the world around it loses direction. When the mist of crowded gatherings fades, the true nature of organized religion reveals itself like a structure that has stood too long upon fractured ground. Its shadowed side is not newly formed. It has only been concealed beneath stage lights and prayers repeated until the listener begins to believe they are true. In the visions seen, the first image that appears is the luxurious padded chairs in the pastor's office, the polished car keys on the wooden desk, and outside the door, a long line of believers struggling with unpaid bills. This contrast is not merely economic, it is a misalignment of spiritual essence, where the one leading is sustained by indulgence, while the ones following are sustained only by promises. Within this picture, a familiar mechanism emerges: sermons turned into tools, and the prosperity gospel used as a curtain to hide greed. When people are told that giving more brings greater blessing, the statement carries the tone of a transaction rather than an invitation into grace. And in every season of offering, there are faces with tears, not from awe at God's generosity, but from fear of being judged as lacking faith if they do not place money in the envelope. Within that mist appears a cycle. The pastor promises a season of financial harvest. The believers give, the pastor becomes wealthier, the believers remain unchanged, and the cycle repeats. Many young people do not say it aloud, but their hearts record it. They see the new car in the pastor's parking space. They see the leader's family taking lavish vacations. They see the church calling for new building funds while the surrounding community struggles with unemployment. These signals etch themselves silently into their souls as warnings that something in this operation does not align with the one they were taught to revere. Beneath the shining surface, there appears a darker truth, the subtle manipulation through guilt. When someone asks a question, they're told their faith is weak. When they inquire about finances, they're told they're doubting the anointed one. When they want to know the truth, they're reassured that truth belongs to leadership, not to them. The story of the widow's mite is used as a pressure tool, no longer a story of devotion, but a method to guilt believers into giving away their last coin. And the scripture about the windows of heaven is quoted like a guarantee to justify the pastor's extravagant lifestyle. These pastors are sometimes unaware that they have made themselves the center, leaving God only as a shadow behind their sermons. In the visions, the church building appears like a polished shell whose inner light is no longer hot, only faintly. Many earlier generations accepted this because they believed it was the only path to reach God. But today's generation carries an intuition that refuses to close its eyes to contradiction. They sense distortion in every small detail that older believers have grown too accustomed to notice. Added to this are countless examples, not in one region, but across many, where leaders use their position to shield themselves from accusations, to build walls of devotion from their followers, and to turn the altar into a place that draws financial gain rather than a place that touches the soul. These recurring patterns are not accidental, but the result of a structure that elevates humans above spiritual truth. Prosperity theology, under the sight of the spirit realm, does not carry the frequency of a spiritual promise, but the frequency of bondage, keeping believers waiting endlessly for something that never materializes.
And when each promise is delayed, the responsibility is placed on the believer that their faith was not enough, instead of on the leader whose spiritual center has strayed far from truth. These distortions accumulate through the years, forming a system fueled by fear where silence is rewarded and truth is punished. This is precisely what the young people of the year 2025 feel so clearly, not because they are rebellious, but because they are perceptive.
They recognize that the soul cannot be nourished by promises without truth, cannot be healed when the healer lives a double life, cannot be guided when the guide has lost his way. In the quiet of this generation, the shadow of organized religion can no longer remain hidden. It appears as clearly as a crack in glass, and they know it is time to leave the bright lights and return to a pure source of illumination. When I close my eyes in the hour of stillness, I see time no longer flowing in a straight line, but opening into circles nested within one another, each circle a lifetime, each circle, a memory of an entire people. And in that very moment, a stream of light pulls me back to an ancient vision where the first proclamation of 400 years was planted into history like a seed waiting for its day to bloom.
I stand there between the two shores of time, seeing Abraham in a deep night, the darkness unable to conceal the presence of the Eternal One who was speaking words he could not fully understand, that his descendants would wander into a land not their own, oppressed, imprisoned, until a divinely appointed moment was fulfilled. I hear that proclamation as though spoken again within my soul, not to awaken old sorrow, but to reveal the pattern of every spiritual cycle, that there are ages which must swallow darkness before light is allowed to break through. And from that moment, the vision shifts swiftly like wind sweeping across water, carrying me to shorelines where chained bodies were driven onto ships, their cries rising like the cries of a new Israel being pushed away from familiar ground. I see figures pressed together in narrow, dark holes, their eyes not weak, but shining strangely, as if they knew their souls had entered a cycle they did not choose yet had been destined for. The rhythm of waves striking the hull became a reminder that the appointed time had begun, that the 400-year clock was now turning. Each passing year carved a mark into the soil of America, the mark of weeping, of prayer, of songs rising into the night, unheard by any priest. As the cycle continued, I see images of small churches with low wooden roofs, where those newly forced into the faith read scriptures that had been cut in half, denied stories of Moses, denied the promise of deliverance. Yet within their souls, I still hear a faint beat, a whisper that the true story had not been lost, only locked away. And I see the key resting in the hands of the next generation, though they did not yet know how to use it. Then the vision leaps across centuries, showing groups gathered in secret prayer, no clergy standing before them, no ritual binding them to form, only drum's breath and a direct connection to the one their ancestors had known, by an ancient name, a connection never broken, but buried under layers of doctrine imposed by others. When I look upon the year 2025 from the height of the vision, I see it as a bronze colored seal pressed upon the surface of time, signaling that the 400-year cycle has reached completion. And when that number glows, I feel a powerful movement in the souls of the young, not the movement of confusion, but of remembering. They do not know why they can no longer bear the church, but I know, for in the vision I see clearly a cord once severed now beginning to reconnect, drawing them back to the source where they are called, not through the mouth of a pastor, but through the breath of the one they seek. I see pastors in panic, staring at empty seats and believing faith is dying. But in the vision, faith is returning to its true place, no longer confined to grand buildings, but living in small rooms where a young person opens scripture and reads it for the first time, without a filter placed over their eyes.
I feel the trembling of the earth, like a people preparing to step out of Egypt, not an Egypt of geography, but an Egypt of the mind, of fear, of dependence on intermediaries. In that moment, I am shown a line of light appearing before me, declaring that the departure from the church in this year is not an act of rebellion, but the soul's response to a cycle that has expired. When 400 years and no force can hold them inside an old system, for the door of spiritual liberation has opened. And the final image I see before the vision closes is an entire generation standing before that door, not loud, not rebellious, but stepping forward in calm certainty, like those who know their time has come. When looking into the deep layer of history, where collective memory settles like sediment at the bottom of a river, a period appears in which the soul of an entire people was broken by the very scriptures they were forced to believe. The era of slavery did not only strip away bodies, it stripped away the language of the soul by replacing ancestral words with commands selected from pages already cut apart. In the vision, I see the hand of the powerful turning through the Bible, crossing out the verses of freedom, removing the victories of Israel, erasing every image of God, overthrowing the oppressor, leaving only lines such as slaves, obey your masters, as though that were the heart of the faith. That Bible was handed to the chained not to save them, but to mold them into obedient tools. And in the wooden huts, the supervised worship gatherings became traps for the spirit where people were not allowed to speak too loudly, not allowed to read too deeply, not allowed to understand too much to prevent the awakening of the memory that God had once delivered a nation from bondage and could do so again. The images in the vision are so clear that they make me fall silent. I see small groups gathering at night moonlight, slipping through cracks onto their faces, and they whisper stories not found in the cut book. They speak of Moses, of the command to let my people go. They pass to one another not written words, but the living memory of a God who stands with the oppressed. These words travel through the air like smoldering fire, refusing to be extinguished, despite the attempts to suppress them. But beside this hidden fire, I also see what was stolen, the sacred identity of their ancestors, the rituals that connected them to heaven and earth, the ancient sounds that called the Creator by the old names, all labeled as witchcraft, burned, swept away, as though they were never meant to exist. This deprivation was not merely the erasing of a culture, but the severing of a sacred line of communication. I see this pain not expressed in screams, but in the silence of souls who know they are being torn from their roots. In the vision, there is a moment where time seems to stop, when a group of enslaved people secretly learn to read their hands, trembling as they see the true stories for the first time, Exodus, Judges, Psalms, and they realize that the Master feared they would read this. When they saw the truth, they understood why the Bible had been cut, because the entire story is a reminder that God never stands with the oppressor. As they realize this, I see their souls light up like small flames in a night forest, and with one gentle wind, those flames could become a storm of fire. But the system would not allow that. It built fences, placed overseers in every gathering, demanded silence and strictness, using religion as an invisible rope. And then the story moves into the post slavery era where the outer form changed, but the face of control did not, as the church became the place where morality was taught according to the pattern of those who had once ruled over them. In the wide church halls, the image of a white Jesus on the wall was not merely historical inaccuracy, but a psychological suggestion that the divine carried the form of the dominant, and listeners must bow to that form even when their own hearts did not resemble it. This was not simply art,
It was strategy planting deep inside the belief that to approach God, they must first move away from themselves.
In this distortion, I see the deepest wound that the post slavery generations grew up believing their ancestral spirituality was something to be rejected rather than the sacred strength that carried them through the darkest centuries. This flow from the cut Bible, from the controlled sermons, from the repainted religious imagery, created a crack stretching across generations, a crack unseen yet widening within the soul of the people. And today's generation, through intuition and awakening, is looking back at that crack, not to mourn it, but to see that the place where it split is the very place where new light can enter. Across the long arc of history, two distinct paths began to emerge within the Black Church, and each path carried its own spiritual frequency, one rising like a clear trumpet call toward justice, the other softening into a comfortable hum that blended too easily with the culture of the oppressors. As these paths unfolded, they shaped not only the faith of a people, but the destiny of generations that would one day look back and feel the weight of choices made long before they were born. The first path appeared during the era of civil rights, a path forged with sweat, prayer, and courage, where pulpits became platforms of resistance and sacred spaces transformed into command centers for freedom. In this current of spiritual fire stood voices like Martin Luther King Jr. and countless unnamed prophets who looked at the machinery of injustice and declared that God was not hiding behind silence, but walking in the streets with those who refused to bow. Their sermons were not comfortable invitations to wait for heaven, but living reminders that heaven demanded justice on earth. The air in those churches trembled with conviction, and the songs that rose from their gatherings carried the sound of chains breaking even before laws changed. Yet while that prophetic current was alive, another current moved quietly beneath it, shaped by the pressures of respectability, fear, and the desire to avoid conflict. This second stream echoed the tone of the dominant culture teaching obedience to earthly systems and urging believers to remain polite, patient, and agreeable, even as their rights were denied. Respectability became a theology of its own, whispering that survival required conformity, urging men and women to suppress their righteous anger, to dress neatly, to speak softly, to avoid disturbing the fragile comfort of those in power. And as decades passed, this second path grew stronger, fortified by a desire to be accepted, to gain approval, to prove worth within a world that had long refused to acknowledge that worth. When the civil rights era gave way to the late 20th century, this quieter stream opened the door to a new form of church culture, one polished, expansive, and increasingly aligned with the image of prosperity rather than the weight of liberation. The rise of the megachurch was not sudden. It was the culmination of years in which spiritual authority shifted from shared struggle toward curated spectacle. Sanctuaries transformed into theaters of emotional production with lights, choreography, and branded experiences designed to evoke awe, not necessarily conviction. Sermons became motivational speeches wrapped in scripture promising personal breakthrough rather than collective transformation. The pastor, once a shepherd walking among the people, became the equivalent of a brand ambassador, managing not only a congregation, but a media enterprise, a global following, and a narrative carefully crafted to ensure admiration. Under this model, wealth was no longer a matter of stewardship, but a sign of divine approval. Luxury became a testimony, and abundance was used to suggest spiritual superiority. The message shifted from rise together to rise alone, from liberate the community to manifest your personal blessing, from God of the oppressed to God of the successful. Within this transformation, something subtle
yet profound happened to the inner life of the church. The prophetic edge dulled the fire that once confronted injustice cooled, and the gathering became a weekly performance rather than a movement. The sound of collective struggle, once central to worship, was drowned out by polished choirs and tightly timed services that left little space for lament, questioning, or wrestling with truth. And while this new model grew in numbers, it also grew in distance from the people it claimed to serve, because suffering cannot be soothed by spectacle, and injustice cannot be confronted by positivity alone.
The deeper tragedy was not in the creation of large congregations, but in the slow disappearance of spiritual accountability. When a pastor became untouchable, when a congregation was taught to equate questioning with rebellion, and when wealth became the shield that protected leaders from scrutiny, the church ceased to resemble the body of believers in Acts and became more like a corporation guarding its assets.
Young people sensitive to spiritual dissonance recognized this before many older generations did. They felt the hollow echo beneath the surface, sensed the absence of authenticity, and saw clearly the disconnect between what was preached and what was lived. In their silence, in their leaving, they were responding not to a lack of faith, but to the collapse of integrity within the institution.
And thus the two paths diverged completely, the prophetic church shrinking but burning bright, the megachurch expanding yet flickering inwardly. This divergence forms the backdrop for the awakening now unfolding, a reminder that every generation must choose which voice it will follow, the voice of comfort or the voice of truth. When the year 2020 arrived, a quiet unraveling began, not with the sound of rebellion, but with the stillness of empty sanctuaries, as church doors closed and lights dimmed under the weight of a global pandemic. The pause that settled over the world became a mirror, forcing everyone to see what had long been hidden beneath layers of ritual and spectacle.
For decades, the atmosphere inside large churches had served as a net capturing wandering hearts with music, rhythm, and collective emotion. But when the noise fell silent and each believer was left alone in the dim room of their own thoughts, something ancient stirred, something that had been buried beneath routines polished through the years.
Without the choir, without the pulpit, without the carefully scripted environment, people were left face to face with their own spiritual hunger, and many discovered to their surprise that the hunger was deeper than anything the institution had ever satisfied. In this stillness, young people began to ask questions they had never dared to voice, questions that rose from the bare place where truth and longing touch. Do I feel closer to God in a crowd or in silence? Was I worshiping God or the feeling of belonging? Did the presence I sensed each Sunday belong to the Spirit or to the carefully engineered atmosphere designed to move me? These questions opened a fissure in the old structure, and through this fissure, light began to pour. Social media, once a distraction, now became the unexpected sanctuary where confessions flowed freely.
TikTok, with its short bursts of honesty, became a gathering of wandering souls who were unafraid to reveal the wounds that institutional religion had concealed. People spoke of spiritual exhaustion, of financial manipulation of sermons that blamed them for struggling, while leaders justified indulgence with theological acrobatics. They spoke of walking into church feeling hopeful and walking out burdened. Their testimonies spread like embers across a forest floor, catching fire in places the institution had never imagined. For the first time in generations, stories suppressed in pews were spoken openly in public spaces. One voice said, "I stopped attending church and found that God had been waiting for me outside the walls." Another said, "When I stopped giving out of guilt, my heart felt lighter and I finally breathed again." These stories were not fragments of rebellion.
but signals of awakening evidence that the spirit does not live in buildings, but in the quiet chambers of the human soul. As the pandemic continued, the structure of church life began to collapse inward because without the weekly gathering, leaders could no longer rely on emotional momentum to keep people loyal. Faith had to stand on its own, and for many it did not.
The seams torn open by silence revealed how much of the institution had depended on spectacle rather than substance. When eyes were no longer fixed on the stage, people began to see clearly the contradictions they had ignored, the inconsistencies they had excused, the spiritual dissonance they had forced themselves to swallow. Meanwhile, another movement rose from the shadows, a movement of ancestral remembrance and spiritual reclamation.
Home altars appeared in bedrooms, candles lit in quiet corners, prayers whispered in tones that did not mimic the pulpit. Books on African spirituality, on meditation, on ancestral connection spread across nightstands. People who had been warned to fear anything outside the church began to rediscover the richness of the spiritual world that existed before slavery rewrote their identity.
For many, this did not lead them away from God, but brought them closer to the presence they had long sensed but could not fully name. And while these individual awakenings, unfolded scandals, broke across the nation like cracks in a frozen lake, one pastor accused another, exposed another, caught building an empire on the backs of the faithful. The old mantra, touch not the anointed, dissolved in the face of repeated evidence that the anointed were not living in the light they preach. Social media made concealment impossible. Every lie, every misuse of power, every hidden detail rose to the surface with the inevitability of breath rising through water. The illusion of holiness without accountability began to decay, and the institution fought desperately to hold itself together, yet the more it struggled, the more the cracks widened. Young people watching all this did not react with shock, but with recognition. They had sensed for years that something was wrong.
Now, the truth simply caught up with their intuition. The great exodus that followed was not an explosion, but a quiet stepping away, one soul at a time, like individuals leaving a building that no longer felt safe. The pandemic merely revealed what had already died. The collapse of the illusion did not destroy faith, it purified it.
It stripped away the scaffolding, leaving only the core, and in that core, many found God more present, more intimate, more real than any Sunday service had made him feel. In this way, the unraveling became the doorway through which a generation stepped into spiritual clarity, not because they abandoned the sacred, but because they sought it at its source.
When examining the rise and endurance of the institutional church system, one sees clearly that such a vast structure does not exist merely through spiritual devotion. It survives because multiple layers of power benefit from its continued control. These layers are not always visible to the untrained eye, yet within the deeper patterns of history and human behavior, they reveal themselves like silhouettes behind a veil. The first and most obvious beneficiaries are the leaders who stand at the center of the religious empires, individuals whose wealth, influence, and security depend on the unwavering loyalty of congregations taught to give without question. For decades, they have built lifestyles that would rival corporate executives not through innovation or service, but through the steady funneling of tithes presented as holy obligation.
Lavish homes, private jets, carefully curated public images, and financial opacity form the pillars of their authority. These leaders benefit from a system where questioning is framed as rebellion, where transparency is avoided under the guise of spiritual hierarchy, and where the devotion of the poor is converted into the comfort of the powerful.
But behind them stands a second layer of beneficiaries, governments, and political systems that find great value in a population trained to obey, endure, and wait for heavenly justice instead of demanding earthly reform. A church that teaches compliance provides stability for institutions that fear the collective voice of the oppressed. When sermons emphasize personal salvation over communal liberation, structural injustice remains unchallenged.
When congregations are told to pray for change rather than organize for it, the existing power structures breathe easier. History shows repeatedly that when the church aligned with liberation governments, took notice and reacted with force, but when the church aligned with respectability and quiet endurance, governments celebrated its influence. This pattern reveals a clear truth: institutions of power prefer a faith that soothes rather than a faith that awakens. Beyond political interests lies a third beneficiary, the ideology of white supremacy, which has woven itself into the religious imagination for centuries by shaping how the sacred is depicted and understood. The image of a white Jesus, serene and European, became a psychological weapon that distorted spiritual identity, suggesting subtly and persistently that divinity is inseparable from whiteness.
This image does not merely occupy stained glass windows. It occupies the subconscious, reinforcing a hierarchy in which people of color must see holiness through the eyes of their historical oppressors. The widespread adoption of prosperity theology, rooted in white evangelical tradition and later adopted by black churches, further served this ideology by teaching individualism over community wealth accumulation, over justice and obedience, over discernment. In suppressing African spiritual heritage and demonizing ancestral memory, the system ensured that believers would remain disconnected from their original sources of strength. A people who forget their own sacred lineage become easier to control, easier to mold, and easier to deceive.
Yet all of these forces still depend on the fourth and most expansive beneficiary, the religious institution itself, a network of denominations boards, trustees, and corporate structures that collectively hold billions in property, assets, and influence. These institutions are not designed to reform themselves. Their survival depends on protecting the system from scrutiny. They uphold loyalty to hierarchy over loyalty to truth, and they reward silence over honesty.
When scandals erupt, they shield leaders, not congregations. When questions arise, they discourage inquiry, insisting that spiritual maturity means obedience. Institutions of this scale do not fear sin, they fear exposure. Their stability relies on the belief that sacred authority flows downward in a chain untouched by accountability.
When people begin to question that chain, when they demand to see financial transparency, when they insist that spiritual authority align with ethical living, the entire architecture trembles. Young people sensing this instability do not walk away because they reject God. They walk away because they recognize a structure that no longer carries the vibration of truth. They see the beneficiaries clearly, even when the institution insists they do not.
In their silence, in their distance, in their refusal to participate in the ritual of exploitation, they are cutting the lifeline that keeps the system alive, and that is why the system trembles. A structure built on loyalty cannot survive once loyalty dissolves. A hierarchy built on illusion cannot stand once the illusion is pierced. And the beneficiaries who once thrived in the shadows now fear the light that exposes every hidden motive. Thus, the unraveling of the old order is not just inevitable, it is already happening, one awakened soul at a time. In every age of spiritual transition, There comes a moment when the old voices try to pull the seeker back, insisting that loyalty to the institution is the same as loyalty to God. And in this generation, as millions quietly step away from the structures that once defined their faith, a familiar chorus rises filled with warnings, accusations, and fears.
Yet behind each objection lies a deeper truth, a truth that becomes visible only when the veil is lifted and the soul begins to see with clarity rather than conditioning. The first objection, often spoken with trembling sincerity, is that exposing corruption or leaving an institution is the same as attacking God's anointed. But when examined under the light of discernment, this claim dissolves. Throughout Scripture, prophets confronted religious leaders who misused power. The measure of anointing was never prestige or wealth, it was fruit, compassion, humility, justice. When leaders feed themselves instead of the flock, when they enrich their own lives while their people struggle, they reveal not divine anointing, but spiritual distortion. The soul awakening in this generation feels this instinctively recognizing that silence in the face of wrongdoing is not reverence but complicity. The second objection insists that the church building is the house of God and that leaving its walls is the same as leaving the presence of the divine. Yet history and scripture whisper otherwise. Sacred encounters have happened in deserts, in caves, in fields, in quiet rooms where no choir sang. The institution may claim exclusivity, but the spirit has never been confined to architecture or steeples. Young people sense this with a clarity that feels ancient, as though they are remembering something the world tried to make them forget, that the true temple is carried within the body and that the voice of the divine is not trapped behind stained glass. A third objection claims that those who step away are in danger of losing their faith, but the testimonies emerging tell a much different story. Many who leave the institution discover a more intimate spiritual life, one no longer filtered through hierarchy and ritual. They find that the quiet space of solitude reveals truths ground out by amplified sermons. They find that God speaks more clearly when no one is standing between the seeker and the source. For some, this shift is not rebellion, but a return to the simple and personal communion that marked the earliest followers who gathered in homes and fields rather than monolithic structures. A fourth objection attempts to soften the institution's failures by insisting that not all churches are corrupt. And while this is true on the surface, it does not absolve the system of widespread dysfunction. When leaders who are good remain silent while others harm the flock, the silence becomes its own form of participation. An institution that punishes truth tellers and protects abusers creates an environment where corruption is not an exception but a pattern. The awakening generation sees this pattern, clearly recognizing that selective goodness cannot outweigh systemic harm. They desire not a rare good leader, but a structure where integrity is non negotiable. The fifth objection appeals to legacy, urging people to stay out of respect for the generations who came before. It points to D. And yet, reverence for ancestors is not the same as repeating their footsteps without discernment. The ancestors who fought for justice did so by confronting corruption, not preserving it. Honoring their courage means continuing their work of truth, not clinging to a system that has drifted far from the values they defended. Legacy becomes meaningless when used as a chain instead of a torch. The final objection warns that those who walk away will one day regret it before God, as though questioning an institution were the same as offending the divine. But the soul that has awakened knows that accountability is not the enemy of faith. It is the very expression of faithfulness. Those who expose darkness do so not to destroy belief, but to reclaim it from distortion. The divine call is not to blind obedience, but to truth, courage, and integrity. When these objections are laid bare, what remains is clarity. The people are not leaving God. They are leaving confusion, manipulation, and imbalance. They are stepping toward a faith that is personal, rooted, and unmediated. They are rediscovering the sacred without the shadows that once obscured it. And in their departure, a deeper truth becomes visible, that the path of awakening often leads first through the valley of unlearning before rising into the light of understanding. When entering the deepest layer of the vision, I sense my soul being carried into a space that does not belong to human time, where the voices of generations long gone echo like wind moving through an ancient forest. There I see clearly what many today can only feel but cannot yet name, that the departure from the church is not the collapse of faith, but the return of faith. In that gentle yet blade sharp light, I am shown the image of a generation standing before two doors, one familiar leading into organized religion, with its neat rows of seats, its rehearsed sermons, and the flame of faith wrapped tightly in ritual.
The other door leads into a vast expanse where God is not enclosed by wooden walls or loud music, where each soul stands before him without an intermediary. I see the young choosing the second door, not because they wish to oppose anyone, but because they hear a deeper calling within themselves. In that vision, I see the eyes of the young eyes, not angry, but clear, not doubtful, but thirsty for truth. They do not wish to leave God, they wish to leave the mist that has obscured him from their sight. They do not wish to destroy tradition, they simply want to recover the source from which tradition has drifted too far. As this image sharpens, a current of understanding moves through my soul, like light cutting through a dark veil, that their departure is an answer to a proclamation spoken centuries earlier. A call to leave spiritual Babylon, to leave structures that have hardened, to leave systems that use the name of God but no longer carry his breath. I hear a sentence resound in the silence, not with sound, but with knowing that when a structure can no longer serve as a vessel for life, the soul is permitted to step out and find a new vessel. And the young doing exactly that. In the vision, I see small rooms, candlelight flickering on walls, scriptures opened, not according to the weekly sermon plan, but according to inner leading. I see small groups praying in silence, no leader standing above them, only the equality of souls seeking their way to truth. I see those who were once wounded in church finding their voices again, not through permission granted by someone else, but through healing that begins to grow from within. And I realize what many earlier generations did not live long enough to see, that the fall of old systems is not lost, but the clearing of soil for new seeds. The seed I see in the vision is not a new denomination, not a new organization, but a form of faith, closer to how the first ones once walked, with God direct, honest, uncovered, unpainted. I see a generation not afraid to ask questions, and because of this, they are led toward true answers. I see them standing before God, not carrying the burden of guilt placed upon them by human systems, but carrying only the longing to know Him as He truly is. As the vision deepens, I see the turning of a people who had once been bound to religion like a soft chain, now breaking that chain through the light of understanding. They are not resisting religion, they simply refuse to let it replace the sacred bond they have with the Creator. I see their ancestors standing behind them, eyes glowing like embers, speaking not with words, but with presence, that they have waited for this moment, waited for this generation to recover what had been severed, waited for them to remember that their souls never belonged to the system, but to the one who led Israel through the Red Sea. Finally, as the light fades, I hear a reminder rise within the soul
that the new door has opened and each must choose to step. There is no coercion, only invitation. There is no threat, only truth. And the truth is that this generation is awakening at the appointed time. As the vision closes, what remains within me is the certainty that the new Exodus has begun, not taking bodies out of Egypt, but taking minds out of darkness, so that each soul may stand before the light of the Creator without fear.